So everything after this should be live.
Hello, I'm Bruce Nystrom, and I serve as Chair of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I asked the members of the Advisory Committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. So please say here or present when I call your name. Jacqueline Lightcap.
Here.
Kimberly Becker.
I'm here. I'm on mute. Sorry.
Okay. Allison Bell.
Here.
Claudia Dozier.
Here.
Linda Heinzman Powell.
Here.
Emily Kessler.
Here.
Pete Peterson. Christy Marie Steele.
Here.
Did I say that right?
Yes.
Ah, good for me. Mike Wassmer.
Here.
And Alice Zhang.
Here.
Okay, we also have David Fye and Leslie Allen as staff of the BSRB. So
Yes.
the next thing is David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Bruce. And just also for the record, we have a guest presenter at the meeting today, Holly Benenkoza, and so she is also in attendance as well. And we do have the conference call line active, so if I hear any beeps, I will go ahead and let the advisory committee members know that as well. This is David Fye, Executive Director
I'm
for
pretty
the
sure I do.
Behavioral Sciences
I'm in
Regulatory Board.
a Zoom meeting right now. If I don't have it, I'll call you back.
All right, this is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. One presenter has been granted 20 minutes to speak and present information to the advisory committee today, followed by 10 minutes for questions from members of the committee. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On February 16th, 2022, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material are posted on the board's website, and you may request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did just hear a beep on the conference call line. If someone is attending the meeting on the conference call line, could you go ahead and state your name for the record? Okay, if I hear it beep again, I will let you know. With that, I think we're ready to move on to the next item.
Okay. Thank you, David. The meeting is now called to order. The advisory committee will begin its discussion with the first item on the agenda. I hope everyone received a copy of the agenda by email. Mr. Fye did state that he is going to add an extra agenda item that has to do with pre-approval of CE presenters that we will discuss under old business. Or is that new business? Anyway.
Yeah, I think it'll be new business, so we'll just go ahead and add it to the end of the new business. If that's okay with you.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, so now you received a copy of the minutes from our last meeting, February 9, 2022. Has everyone read it? Are there any corrections, additions, deletions? to those minutes? Seeing none, do I hear a motion to approve those minutes?
Real quick, the only edit was that the meeting says April 15th instead of April 13th, but I don't know if that's needs to be edited on the notes.
Okay, so noted. Any other corrections or? Okay, do I hear a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
I motion to approve.
Thank you. Do I hear a second?
I second. Emily seconds.
Okay, everyone in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Okay, hearing none, the minutes stand approved. That brings us down to the Executive Director's report. Mr. Fye.
Thank you, Bruce. So I'm going to go ahead and provide some updates on BSRB operations, also some legislative updates, and then some information from the last board meeting on March 14th. So we are still under a lot of the governor's directions for the pandemic. A couple of months ago, they relaxed the requirement for masks to be worn by state employees in state office buildings. So that is optional now, but a lot of the other restrictions still apply, including a limitation or prohibition on in-person meetings, which is why we still are having all of our advisory committee and board meetings over Zoom. And when that does come to the point to where the governor gives us direction that that has been relaxed or changed, we will let you know. Some of the advisory committees and the board has already had some preliminary discussions about how to move forward after we're allowed to have in-person meetings again. But it looks like for some committees, they will go back to having some meetings in person and some will maintain the Zoom meetings. So I will let you know when I get further direction from the governor's office on any changes in that regard. Most staff are working in the office each day. As of beginning of January, all the staff returned to the office full time. We have 2 investigators that are doing some teleworking over a pre-approved pilot program for telework. So we are collecting information on that through the end of June and then looking to expand it if we have good results on how that pilot is working for us. In terms of some legislative updates, the legislature is currently on a 3-week break, and then they are planning to come back for a period called omnibus, where they go ahead and consider any vetoes that the governor has put on bills that were passed prior to them leaving for that break. The period of time right before they left was a very popular period of time for passing legislation, and some of the biggest bills were passed during that time period. One of the biggest bills was the appropriation bill, and that is House substitute for Senate Bill 267, and it was passed by the legislature on April 1st. The budget for the BSRB is included in that bill, so that gives us authority to expend money for this fiscal year and next fiscal year. It was presented to the governor on April 8th, and we are currently awaiting any action by the governor. The governor does have authority to veto that bill or to do line item vetoes, and so we're waiting to hear back on any action from the governor on that bill. Next item is that the BSRB bill has passed the legislature, which is very exciting. It's been quite a journey this year. In January, the BSRB requested introduction of a bill that had 3 recommendations by the board. They included a recommendation for the social work profession, the addiction counselor profession, and also the licensed psychology profession. That was originally in Senate Bill 387, which was introduced in the House or the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. And that committee had a hearing on the bill, amended the bill to remove the recommendation for the licensed psychology profession, but the other 2 recommendations stayed in the bill. The Senate committee did vote the bill out favorably after it was amended, and it was available to be worked on the Senate floor, but it was not worked by one of the legislative deadlines, and so that bill essentially died. And under normal circumstances, we would not be able to have a bill this session, but I was able to work with individuals in the legislature on the House side and was able to get that version of the amended bill to be reintroduced on the House side fairly late into the session as House Bill 2734. And then that bill was expedited for hearing in the House Health and Human Services Committee. That committee went ahead and heard the bill and worked the bill the same day, passed it out of committee with no changes. It was the amended version, so that version didn't include the original recommendation for the licensed psychology profession, but they did go ahead and vote out House Bill 2734 favorably from that committee, and then it was passed by the House chamber. After that time, the committees really weren't meeting to have a lot of bill hearings going forward, so there wasn't the opportunity to have a hearing on that bill on the Senate side, but since it passed one chamber, it was available to be considered in conference committee, which is what happened. When the House and Senate pass bills that have items of difference, they are able to move to a conference committee period where they resolve the items of difference. And when they do that, they can add in additional content, which is what happened with the BSRB bill. So there was a Senate Bill 453, and the contents of our bill, House Bill 2734, were added to Senate Bill 453. And that bill, Senate Bill 453, was passed by both the House and the Senate. So right now we are waiting. That bill has also been presented to the governor, but as of yesterday, there was not action by the governor on that bill. So we are waiting for the governor's office based on the margins that it passed the House and the Senate. I think it is, we expect it to pass and the governor to sign it. But just to let you know, right now, the governor has 10 days from when it's presented to her to either sign it into law, to do nothing. And if she does nothing, then it becomes law, or the governor can veto it, at which point it would be available for the legislature to take action on when they return. So very excited.
I could interrupt for just a
Yes.
second. I don't know how many of you are experts at the workings of your state legislature, but you just heard a good exposition from a genius and a very highly skilled person who worked hard and got that passed and all this and that. I know I've heard this 2 or 3 times. My eyes still glaze over everything he did. But I just want to recognize David and give him a kudos for me. Okay.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I appreciate that.
Continue.
I'll go ahead and provide an update on another bill that is relevant to the BSRB, and that is, it originally was substitute for Senate Bill 34. This bill had a few different versions, but the most recent version of the bill would require all agencies to provide a report to the Joint Committee on Rules and Regulations every 5 years on all the regulations for the agency. And they would have to indicate whether each regulation was essential for basically the implementation of state law, or if it was not, they should go through the process of having those regulations revoked. And so this was something that was brought before the board back in a special meeting in February, along with some other bills that had a connection to the BSRB. At the time, the board requested that I provide testimony on this bill should it go further, because we are in the process right now of reviewing all of our statutes and regulations and trying to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to make sure that the language in those regulations and statutes is still accurate. And so we're already taking part in this process voluntarily, but creating the type of report they're calling for the over 120 regulations that we have for the agency would mean that we would have to repurpose staff away from doing licensing or doing investigation and discipline, which would cause delays, or would lead us to have to bring in additional staff to help out. So we did not want to cause delays in the process. And so we brought these concerns forward to the legislature, but the legislature was interested in all agencies being included. So we were included in the final version of that bill. The final version was actually put into House Bill 2087, and that has been passed by the legislature and forwarded to the governor for review. Here are some updates from the board meeting in March. The board met March 14th, 2022. One item the board discussed is for the last couple of years, the board meetings have been starting at 10 a.m. and going till about 1. If we are continuing the online format, which looks to be the course for the foreseeable future, the start time is going to be moved to 9 a.m. for those regular board meetings. And so that will go from 9 a.m. until about noon, at least for the foreseeable future for full board meetings. In terms of other items, last year the board did a certain amount of work on a document called the Board Governance Policy, which was a document providing a lot of direction to board members and some of the aspects of the agency. That document had not been updated in about 10 years, and so it was due for a lot of revisions, and that was split ultimately into two documents: an expectations for board members and also an advisory committee policy. Well, similarly, on the investigation and discipline side of the office, there is an investigation policy for the BSRB that has not been updated since about 2009. And so it is also in need of some significant revisions to match the current work of the CRC and of the board. So I'll be providing a report to the board with some recommended changes in terminology and some other items for the board to discuss. And that will be considered by the board at the next meeting in May. Additionally, one item I brought to the board's attention is that in an effort to go ahead and provide more visibility and transparency, a lot of the times in our statutes and regulations, there are references to authority being for the board or certain decisions being made by the board. And in some of those cases, it really does mean the full board. In other cases, it means the BSRB acting on behalf of the board. And in certain situations, it means the executive director instead of the board. And then other times it means the complaint review committee, or perhaps an advisory committee or a board member. And so in an effort to really kind of clean this up, I'm going to be bringing statutes and regulations to the board for review and really trying to clarify what we mean when we say the board in each of these contexts. And if there does need to be a renewal of certain delegation motions, we'll have the board consider those so that we'll have a clear understanding of what we mean when we say the board in the context of all the statutes and regulations for the board. This is not an easy process, and it's not going to be a quick process, but hopefully over the next year, we'll be able to kind of go through that and clarify some of those items a bit more. The board discussed the topic of board-approved supervisors. Currently, right now, there are board-approved supervisors for the professions of professional counseling and marriage and family therapy. And board members wanted to discuss whether there were sufficient opportunities for board-approved supervisors to receive the required training they need to attain to be board-approved supervisors. And if there are not available trainings out there or sufficient available trainings, is there anything the board can do to assist in that process? And so that was the beginning of that conversation. There were no formal recommendations by the board, but I think that will be something the board will keep an eye on going forward and may continue that conversation at future meetings. Additionally, I was invited to serve as a member of a committee for one of the associations that we work with. As of January of this year, we became a member of SIPAC, which is a multi-state compact for licensed psychologists. Individuals who wish to participate under the SIPAC would have to apply to the SIPAC Commission for the right to practice telehealth in other compact states, or a limited number of days of in-state practice through the SIPAC Commission. But since we are a member of that state, or that compact, I was asked if I would like to be a part of one of the committees. And this was the first time that I've been asked if I wanted to serve as a member of a committee for an association. So I brought it before the board to see if they would like me to bring such opportunities to them for review, or how they want me to handle those. And the board had a discussion. They basically said that I should use my best judgment, understanding that my primary focus should be on the work of the BSRB, but that serving on some of these committees could be beneficial for the work of the board as well. So I will keep you informed if I accept any of those positions. I did not accept that position after looking through it fully, but I'll keep you informed if I do accept any positions for some of those national associations. A couple other topics. One item specifically affecting the behavior analyst advisory committee members. So the advisory committee members have, in the advisory committee policy, and prior to that, the board governance policy, it was stated that terms for serving on the advisory committees would be 2 years, and that members could be reappointed for essentially 4 terms. So members could serve a maximum amount of time of 8 years. And so there was a question with the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee, and I brought it to the board, and I said, there's been an effort by the board to go ahead and clean up some of the processes for the advisory committees. How would you like me to view this going forward? Because, we are trying to, if we have members who have served on advisory committees over 8 years, we're trying to have those members come off the committees, and then having those committee members or committees appoint new members. And from my review of the records, the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee started back at the fall of 2015. maybe spring of 2016. And so how should we review those members that are on the committee, since there were periods of time where the advisory committee did not meet? Now, there was also another committee that did not meet the whole time. I think that was the master's level psychology committee. And so basically what the decision was to use the start date as the start of that service. And even if there were years where there were no meetings, essentially you look at that entire block of time from the start time to the current time. And so using that as a factor, what it means is that some of the members of the advisory committee will need to come out off the committee next year at the end of June 30th, 2023, because if they started serving in 2015, 8 years will have passed by the time that comes up June 30th of 2023. So I did want to go ahead and have that conversation with you all to make you aware of that. It's still over a year away, but next year when members do come off the advisory committee, you'll probably want to go through the process again of accepting applications for individuals interested in serving on the advisory committee, and then reviewing those materials, and then making recommendations on new advisory committee members. And then the board had 2 other comments on future meeting topics. And these were things that were not discussed in full detail at the board meeting, but they wanted to go ahead and note that they were going to plan to discuss these at future meetings. One was that there are certain states and also other agencies that have a program that's called an impaired provider program. So in certain cases, when you have a practitioner who struggles with substance abuse or needs mental health treatment, and there are issues concerning discipline, as an alternative to certain discipline, some agencies use a program where an individual can voluntarily submit themselves to receive treatment in lieu of some of the disciplinary action, or it can be a part of the disciplinary process. It could be one of the options that are made available. We currently do not use a program like that for the BSRB or for the practitioners under the BSRB, but it is something that our legal counsel was aware of from some of the other agencies they work with, and I have heard some discussion about that from other states. So the board is going to have some conversations at meetings coming up to see if that would be appropriate for the BSRB to look into and possibly use as part of our disciplinary process. And then the last item, the board discussed briefly, they want to look in the future about having an approach to telehealth standards. There is currently an effort right now from all the advisory committees to look at the unprofessional conduct regulations, and this kind of fits somewhere in that too. But the board may want to look at if there can be a way to have more standardized telehealth standards between the professions, knowing that there are going to be some items of difference based on some professions providing certain testing or assessments. But there are current efforts from other entities to provide telehealth standards. There was a bill that was introduced this year that would have started a committee to go ahead and look at making recommendations for telehealth standards for physical medicine, but also psychological or telehealth services. And so this could be a topic for the board to have a discussion on before some of those other efforts come up. And so that's something for the board to discuss at future meetings as well. So with that said, I'll go ahead and end my report, and I can stand for any questions on any of those items.
Hi, David. This is Linda Heinzman Powell. That psych pack, does that include behavior analysts?
No, it is limited just for the licensed psychologist, and it does not include the master's level psychologist either. It was very, very tightly written just for licensed psychologists in states.
And so if we wanted to look at, would that be under the jurisdiction of our committee? If we wanted to look at the development of something similar with surrounding states for behavior analysts, would that be something we would undertake, or would that be something that's not part of this committee?
Well, so it may be a little bit outside of this committee. I am aware of a couple different compacts right now. There is the SciPac compact, which was started by, I believe, different associations, and then they went ahead, and I believe The ASPPB is one of the associations most closely connected with the SIPAC Commission. There is also one for professional counseling, which I believe was started by the ACA and I believe some other associations that were working with them. There is currently being a compact that is being written for the social work profession. It had to do with a grant, I think, that was provided by the Department of Defense for compacts. But that one is not actually public yet. They're still working on the language for that social work one. So I know that there are a number of groups that are working on different compacts, but the only two that I'm aware of that are fully developed now are the SIPAC one for licensed psychologists and then the one for professional counselors. And that one just started getting members last year. I think last year they had 2 states join, and then they may have had a few more join this year. But I have not heard of one for the behavior analyst profession, but there may be individuals talking about that outside that I'm not aware of.
Okay.
I've heard rumors that nursing may be considering some interjurisdictional pacts also, but that's just a rumor. So I think these kind of interjurisdictional pacts are kind of the thing for the future. We're not going to be limited to the state in which you reside.
So if it's not under the jurisdiction of this committee, then we wouldn't be violating any committee rules or regulations if a group of us that are on this committee got together outside of this committee to pursue interstate compacts.
So I think as long as your discussions don't involve, the work of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee, then I don't think that would be any restriction. But yeah, as far as I know, that there are no behavior analyst compacts that have been discussed that I have heard of so far.
Okay, thank you.
And as the Board of Nursing, I believe that they did join a compact a few years back. And it's set up a little differently than the SIPAC compact because the Board of Nursing one, I think, envisioned more in-state practice. So you're physically providing services in one state versus another. And so what they did when they set that one up was they allowed states to have a license fee if you're practicing just in, let's say, Kansas. But if you would like to purchase a multi-state license, then you could pay a higher rate. And then if you're someone who is on the border between Kansas and Missouri, you could practice in both of those if they are both part of the compact. The SIPAC one is a little different because it's really focused on telehealth services. And as opposed to Kansas being able to charge a multi-state license and allow people to practice in different states, it's really being handled separately by that SIPAC commission, which could lead to certain concerns that were addressed by us last year in terms of oversight or the loss of revenue for individuals who currently have a Kansas license who live out of state, and they may go ahead and drop those licenses to practice under the SIPAC commission. So all licensed psychologists have to renew their license in June of even numbered years. So that's something we're going to be looking at here coming up in the next few months. But looking at that impact is going to be something that we'll have to weigh kind of going forward.
Any other questions or discussion for Mr. Fai's report? Very good. So we'll move on to old business. A follow-up on recommendations to add a behavior analyst to the board of BSRB and to the complaint review committee. David, you've already mentioned this a little bit.
Yeah, and Bruce, there was the presentation by our guest speaker that was right about this item.
Okay, do you want to do that first, or?
Yeah, I think that would be fine. And I can go ahead and preface that presentation as well. Sure. Okay, great. Well, as we talked about at the last Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee meeting, there was a request by an individual. So currently in our statutes, KSA 65-7502 notes that licensed behavior analyst and licensed assistant behavior analyst are certified by a certifying entity and meet certain criteria for licensure as defined by the board. In terms of being from a certifying entity, it means the National Accredited Behavior Analyst Certification Board or other equivalent national accredited non-governmental agency approved by the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. So currently the BSRB recognizes the BACB, but there was a request of whether or not another entity, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, would fit under the equivalent standard. And this is not something that the board had considered in the past, but the advisory committee had a preliminary discussion on it. And then for this advisory committee, thought it would be helpful for the members of the committee to hear from a representative of the QABC or QABA. And so Holly, and sorry, your name, Holly, you were here as a guest speaker for us. And so Holly Benenkoza, I believe. And so we invited you to come and present some information to the advisory committee members. The advisory committee members, just to clarify that, they don't have the authority to change the statutes or regulations, but these are individuals who are currently practicing in Kansas and familiar with this profession. And so they have the ability to make recommendations to the board concerning issues like this. So we thought it would be helpful to receive some information on your association. And also just to let the members know, in your packet, I provided some handouts that were provided by Ms. Benenkoza. And also I provided some background information on the current accrediting body we recognize, the BACB. So you have some background materials for both groups for your comparison. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Ms. Benenkoza, and you can provide some information to the advisory committee members.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good morning, committee and board members. I'm very excited to be able to present this information to you. I know a lot of people don't know much about QABA. We are the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board. I did create a PowerPoint. Is it okay to share my screen?
Yes, that would be fine. Let me make sure that you're able to share that.
Sure.
Go ahead and try to share. I think you should be able to now.
Okay. There we go. I think I have the right one here. Okay. Can you see my slideshow okay?
Yes, looks like a deck of slides. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So what I want to talk about is basically QABA itself, and then also our master's program, the QBA, which is parallel to the BCBA. So are you able to see the next slide? I just want to make sure it's going through. It now says QABA Credentialing Board, founded in 2012.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Okay. So QABA, founded in 2012, was actually created by a group of behavior analysts, psychologists, and other professions in the field of behavior analysis that wanted to make sure that autism and other developmental disorders were addressed in coursework to become certified. We felt that, or I should say they, I wasn't one of the founders, they felt that it was important to know information about who these individuals are that they were servicing. And so they decided that it would be important to include it in coursework. And so I want to talk about the Qualified Behavior Analyst. This is our QBA. This is parallel to the BCBA, as I mentioned. This credential is accredited by ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute. It is a very rigorous application process. They also perform annual audits called a surveillance, and that is also very rigorous. They also, for the QBA, we also had a job task analysis performed by subject matter experts. So a lot of these subject matter experts were actually BCBAs. They were doctors of behavioral health. BCBA Ds. And so we didn't just pick random people off the streets or anything. These are subject matter experts, and they created this job task analysis. They created the blueprint for the QBA. They created the exam, the questions. They created the coursework, the the percentages of what the courses should be for the exam. And then they also reviewed the exam. So this wasn't just created by some random people. Like I said, this is subject matter experts. With this exam, it was actually, it was, sorry, I'm trying to catch my breath here. It was, we had psychometric data with it as well. So we didn't, just pull out an exam and say, here's the questions. We actually got a psychometrician, which is required by ANSI, to go ahead and run data analysis on these exams. And this is performed every single year. So we basically have to go in, get him the data, then he comes back with an item analysis. We see what kind of questions, may need to be revised or thrown out. And this is all done by subject matter experts as well. And a little bit information about ANSI. So ANSI is actually the highest standard for accreditation in the US. They are approved by the US Department of Defense, White House National Science and Technology Committee on Forensic Science, OSHA, and the US Department of Energy, and many, many more organizations. Now, the hierarchy for accreditation, just to show the golden standard, you have the ISO, the International Standards Organization, then you have ANSI, then you have the ICE, and then you have the NCCA. So you can see that ANSI actually accredits ICE, who accredits NCCA. So it is the golden standard for accreditation. ANSI is also a member of the IAF, which is the International Accreditation Foundation, which meets the ISO 17024. And I know it's a lot of different numbers and acronyms and everything, but this makes ANSI an international accreditation. And so that's why QABA can say that we are internationally accredited. Which means we are not pulling out of the international marketplace. We are global. It also makes it that QABA certifications are international. They are the only internationally accredited certifications for applied behavior analysis. Now, just to show you a little bit about the QBA, these are our competency standards, or our task list. So we do include autism core knowledge. We have legal, ethical, and professional considerations, core principles of ABA, antecedent interventions, skill acquisition programming, behavior reduction interventions, data collection and analysis, assessment, training, and supervision. And then some of the requirements that the QBA has is the candidate must possess a master's degree or higher from an accredited university for higher education. We do use primary source verification for coursework and degrees. They must have completed 270 hours of approved coursework, or 18 semester credits, including supervision. They require 1,500 hours of supervised field work at 5%. A minimum of 900 hours need to be in the role of a supervisor or program development. They can do 600 hours of one-to-one direct services, but it is not necessary. They can do all $1,500 in a supervisor role or program development under the supervision of an approved supervisor. They require a recommendation from someone, and they also require a criminal background check or an attestation from an employer who has previously run a background check on them, saying that they are in good standing with the law. They require successful passing of the competency exam, which is proctored by Examity. They must agree to our code of ethics and renewal requirements. And then the board will review the credentialed candidates and approve them, and then they are placed on the registry. Every 2 years, they are due for renewal, and they require 32 CEUs. And let's see, I think I already mentioned the work requirements for the 1,500 hours. So what's involved in the exam? So the QBA exam is only 5% autism core knowledge. I know a lot of people hear QABA, and those who know QABA or have heard of them think we're just an autism certificate, which is not true. QABA is behavior analysis first. We just require knowledge in autism and other developmental disorders. So it's only 5% of our exam. Then we have 5% of legal, ethical, and professional considerations, 14% of core principles of ABA, 12% antecedent interventions, 16% skill acquisition programming, 12% behavior reduction interventions, data collection and analysis at 12%, and assessment at 15%, and then 7% for training and supervision. We do require the training and supervision to become certified, because this is going to be, the higher level who's going to be providing supervision, so they better know how to do it. We do have some pretty well-known approved providers for the QBA coursework, which includes Baekseok University, which is in Korea, Clarion University, Cummings Graduate Institute of Behavioral Health Studies, Kanyang Cyber University, which is also in Korea, the University of South Florida, the University of West Florida Center for Behavior Analysis, University of California, Santa Barbara, and Wooksook University in Korea, and more. I believe we have about 96, I believe was the last count, approved providers. And we're growing even more. So I know that I have 20 minutes, but I feel like probably the best part of this would be for questions, and then I can help answer. But basically what QABA is looking for is to be one of these approved certifying entities for licensure in Kansas. So I'm going to go ahead and end there, and then let the board and committee members go ahead and ask questions.
And I'll ask first, do you prefer Holly or Ms. Benenkoza?
You can call me Holly.
Okay, great.
It's a lot easier.
Well, Holly, I have one question at the start. One thing I'm sure the board would be curious about, are there any other states that you have approached that have agreed to recognize the QABA as one of the accrediting bodies for this purpose?
Oh, yes. We are currently speaking with, let's see, I'll start from the West Coast. Washington, Oregon, California, Illinois, Kansas, Texas, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and there might be more, but those are the ones that I can remember offhand.
Okay.
And you say you're speaking with them, or they have been approved for their licensure?
Some of them we're speaking with, and some of them are basically kind of at the finish line, like needs to be signed by the governor. Some of them are looking for a vehicle to be included in legislation and statutes and rules for some of the legislation that has already been approved. So it's kind of different for every state.
So how many would you say are completely over the finish line then?
What's that?
How many states would you say are completely over the finish line so that the QABA credential is currently recognized?
We don't have any yet, but we're hoping that this session we will get more.
Can you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should let you know we do have licensed QBAs in Virginia. So I apologize. Yes, Virginia would be one.
And then what about currently in insurance company recognition for the QABA certification?
So right now we have the QASPS and the ABAT. As well. The QASPS is parallel to the BC ABA, and it is them and the ABAT, which is parallel to the RBT, are included in TRICARE, Magellan, let's see, United, BHPN or Kaiser, Molina, North Los Angeles, County Regional Center, Anthem Medi-Cal, Blue Shield Promise, And those are the ones I remember offhand. For the QBA right now, because it's new and it was recently accredited in 2020, December of 2020, we are still working with funding sources to accept it. So we do have some Medicaid in various states and areas that will provide funding for the QBA, but we're still working with, it's kind of interesting because it's like you have to work with the states, but you have to work with the funding sources at the same time. And so it's like once we get the ball rolling, then we can go ahead and more people will be joining. But I expect TRICARE to be accepting it very soon, as they already mentioned QASBS and the ABAT in their column manual.
Holly, can you clarify the nonprofit status of QABA?
Sure. So QABA is not a nonprofit. And the thing is that because we are able to be for profit, we're able to invest everything back into the company. And this also helps us provide a cost adjustment to those residing in developing countries. Because a lot of people, say in Nigeria or Brazil, cannot afford $350, to pay for a credential on top of coursework. And so we're able to make those adjustments for them because of that. And our board, all of them are volunteers except the president. The owners have absolutely no say in anything to do with credentialing. They are completely out of the decisions. The board is the one who makes the decisions, and the board is comprised of certificates, clinicians, QBAs and BCBAs. And then we also have a couple of other board members who are not in the field. So
Who
And how
the
are they?
owners?
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was
Go ahead,
going.
Mike.
You mentioned owners. I was looking at your website, and I had a couple questions. The board members are listed. Who are the actual owners, and who actually does the work of the organization? Is it a working board?
I do the work. So it's basically the board that makes the decisions. The board is the one who oversees the credentialing process, who oversees, protects the ASI accreditation. I do the administrative work along with my team. We do the administrative work.
So it's the board. You say they have the final say in
Yes.
everything? Okay.
Yes.
And are members of the board appointed? Are they elected? Like, what are the requirements to be on the board?
They are elected. They submit their resume or CV to the current board, and they review, and then they go ahead and perform interviews. I can make a recommendation because I work with a lot of providers and certificates around the world. And so I can make a recommendation, but it is the board's decision.
But they're not elected by certificates or people practicing. They're appointed by the board.
Yes and no. I mean, there are certificates who want to apply, so if there is a board opening, then we will let our certificates know. And if they choose to apply, then they can. But overall, they are selected by the board, I guess.
Yeah, so they're appointed by the board.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a quick question about the job analysis that was conducted and how that went about to determine sort of the core knowledge and or task list. So you said you had subject matter experts. How were they determined? What kind of credentials did they need to have? And then once the job analysis was created, was a survey created and sent out to certificates to provide feedback and evaluate that? And how was that information analyzed and used to finalize content?
Sure. So I can get you the job task analysis information completely. The job task analysis was actually performed in 2018. So this QBA has been in the works for several years. And those who, we basically kind of put it on an announcement to the world, just saying we're looking for subject matter experts. Some of them happen to be certificates. Some of them worked with some of the providers that, you know, certify their staff either with QABA, BACB, or BICC. And so basically what they needed to do was they had to have at least a BCBA, or they had to have a master's, pass some sort of competency exam in behavior analysis. And so we did have doctors of behavioral health who were also included in the job task analysis. But I would say the majority of them were BCBA, BCBADs, and they had to have at least, I want to say 2 to 5 years of experience in the field as a BCBA or BCBAD.
And then just so my second question, was the job analysis, was a survey created and then sent out to relevant parties? So certificates and people who could provide feedback, and how was that information analyzed and then used?
Sure. So I don't recall if there was an actual survey performed, but and I'm going to say I think, because I'm not 100% sure, I can go back and look. I believe what happened was they had an additional group of subject matter experts review the material and approve it, which is also what happens with the exam. So we'll have a separate, so it's a lot of different separate committees, right? So it's not all the same people. These are all subject matter experts. So what happens is you have a group of subject matter experts who require the same, you know, resume information. That's separate from the people who do the job task analysis, who do the item writing, and they do this under a trained professional who, you know, who guides them on how to write questions. Then you'll have a separate group of subject matter experts who review those questions. Then what happens is the exam is placed in a pilot, and 50 to 100 people take the exam for free is what we did. And then what happens is that those statistics are then sent to the psychometrician. The psychometrician takes the information and shows us like, okay, these are good exam questions, these are bad ones, you need to review these, kind of thing. So then we take those to a whole new committee to review, revise, rewrite, and then it gets sent out again. And so there's an annual surveillance every single year, or I'm sorry, an item analysis every single year to make sure that the exam is, first of all, up to date in the field. If there's any questions that are outdated perhaps, or a lot of questions that are way too hard that nobody's getting, or the questions are way too easy and everybody's getting, then we go ahead and we use our item bank to bring in questions of kind of the same difficulty level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to make sure.
How often are the job analyses?
Every 5 years.
Repeated. Okay.
Every 5 years. Yeah, that's a requirement from AMC.
Holly, I have one more question if nobody else has any. I was looking at well, first of all, are you the only staff you said?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
You said you did all the work. Pardon me?
I'm the executive director.
Okay. I was looking at the credentials of your board, and I was Harry Sadeghi, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly. It says he earned his ABA to become an applied behavior analyst, capitals. I'm not familiar with an ABA degree. What is an ABA?
Well, that I would have to look at his information, but he's actually a lawyer. So he might have experience in ABA.
He says he is an applied behavior analyst, but applied behavior.
There might be a typo. I appreciate you finding that though.
Okay, it's in caps, but okay. And then I was looking at QABA it's been a while since I've looked at it, so I apologize if things have been updated. Mm-hmm. But there was mention of a disciplinary review committee. Is that composed entirely of board members, or is that a separate entity?
So the board members are, yes, the disciplinary review committee is comprised of board members, but we do also have an ethics committee. So if there's something that's unethical that's reported to us, then this committee will take a look, and they are not all board members. One is a certificant, one is a provider, and then the others are board members.
And how were the ethical and disciplinary standards developed, and who developed those?
That was the board. That was the board. And, you know, we go through our policies and everything annually. And if anything needs to be revised, then the board will go ahead, and I may make a suggestion, but it's the board that goes through and determines if they agree with it or if they want to change it. And then they have to vote on it. So it has to be approved by them.
And this is Linda. And then is all that taken into consideration with that ANSI qualification? So that credentialing board looks at how often you've updated it, whether or not your ethical standards are in line with other ethical standards in the field. So how does that work?
Somewhat. So basically what ANSI does is they want to make sure that we have policies in place that uphold the highest standards. We say that our board is the one that does this. And so they will verify that the board has been doing this, has been doing an annual review of these policies. And so there are meeting minutes and everything that the board has done so that we submit to ANSI. So they see that we are still upholding these policies. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. But then like looking at the fact that it's a, and this may or may not make a difference, but looking at the fact that it's a for-profit instead of a not-for-profit, it's like who governs whether or not there's a conflict of interest? I know that you've said that the actual owners of it don't hold any influence over the board and the board's decision, which is made up of professionals, legal people in the field, plus behavior analysts and BCBAs, because there are this ubiquitous set of owners out there. What is the process that you guys have in place to ensure that there really is no conflict of interest or coercion that could happen to the board members that then could impact people becoming a QBA because they paid somebody like $500,000?
Mm-hmm. So ANSI has very strict rules for this. They have very high standards. We have to report all sorts of, monetary information to them. We have, everybody has signed a conflict of interest, a non-disclosure, and the owners have nothing to do with the board. They never go to any meetings. I am the liaison. If they have any information that they want the board to review, then I can make a proposal, and talk to the board about it, but they have nothing to do with board business. They signed agreements that they would not. And with ANSI, with their annual surveillance, they ensure that this stays true.
I'm going to jump in just briefly. This is a very good discussion and lots of good questions and answers. We've been going for a little over 25 minutes now. So I think just to make sure we stay on schedule, if we could just take maybe the next 5 minutes to kind of wrap everything up. And then if there's follow-up questions or follow-up information after that, advisory committee members can either just request that or they can send it to me and then I can follow up with Holly after the meeting. But if we could kind of wrap up this discussion in the next about 5 minutes or so, that would be good.
Who are the owners, Holly?
They're called Elevated Autism Services Team. So I just want to share with you, so QABA, kind of just to sum everything up here, we do abide by ANSI standards. We have job task analysis. We use subject matter experts, and not only are these subject matter experts, QABA certificants, they're behavior analysts from around the world who may not have a QBA certification. I also want to mention too that we have an international standards committee, and these are professionals in the field, subject matter experts around the whole entire world. And these folks have helped us so much with our ethics code to be more internationally inclusive, culturally sensitive. And, you know, if it weren't for these folks, we wouldn't know what is happening in some of these other countries. And our goal is to continue the standardization of ABA. That is our goal. We want people in even the most remote places to be able to receive services by those who meet high quality credentialing. And so I will go ahead and close with that.
Holly, do you know how many QABAs or how many certified people through QABA practice in Kansas or have a registered address in Kansas?
So we used to have 13, but because of some of the laws, they haven't gone further than that. They've let their credentials lapse.
Okay.
But hopefully soon we'll get even more with the approval from you.
I have a question. So if someone is a BCBA, is there some way for them to do they have to go through the same procedure and to become a QBA?
Sure. So, that's something I forgot to mention too. We permit BCBAs to provide supervision to QABA candidates. You know, we are not exclusive. We know that BCBAs have the knowledge and skills to perform that supervision and train QBAs and QASBSs and ABATs. And so I wanted to mention that. Yes, a BCBA may become a QBA, but since December 2020, when ASI accredited the QBAs, all candidates must go through the same process. So even if they're a BCBA, they would still have to pass the competency exam for the QBA. However, they can use their BCBA coursework and supervision hours and apply them to the QBA. So it's a quicker process, but they still would have to pass the competency exam.
And I just have one real quick question. This is Emily. I'm on the website and I could not find your ethics guidelines, and I may just be missing it. I apologize.
Sure. It's under where it says about QABA. If you hover over that, then more will come over and you'll see the code of ethics under there. They're also in each of the candidate handbooks.
I see that. Okay. So it's under the about QABA and then about QABA. Got it. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. And I can send those to you if you want. I know I sent you guys a lot of stuff, so.
And I found them, thank you.
Okay, sure. Anybody else? Well, I so appreciate your time today. I know that I feel this is very important, and I really appreciate you hearing and learning more about QABA and ANSI. And I hope that the discussions are positive and that QABA can be a part of a certifying entity for Kansas.
Great.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for coming and presenting all the information. And if we do get follow-up questions from members, I'll go ahead and reach out to you for more information. So.
Perfect, thank you. Is it okay for me to sign off then?
Sure. Yeah, it would be fine for you to sign off. That would be perfectly okay.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
Okay, a little bit of privilege here before the next agenda item. I need a news flash to provide to all of you. It's snowing in Wichita right now.
What?
Yes. April 13th.
On the east side.
Not on the east side?
Yeah, it's not snowing here.
I'm on the west side, so. Yeah.
That's crazy.
After 90 degrees yesterday.
Yeah, it was
yeah.
hot yesterday.
Sure. Okay. Back to old business. Follow-up recommendations that a behavior analyst to the BSRB and the CRC. David, do you want to? I might try to do that, but I'm sure I'm going to mess it up. It's pretty subtle and complicated.
Well, sure. And I'll give a quick update on this item. This is still something that is pending with the board. One of the items we talked about before was there currently is a ratio right now of about two professional members to one public member on the board. And last time a board member was added, it was for one of the professions. And so if there was going to be another professional member added to the board, one question I had was whether that we need to add a public member as well. So I had reached out to a representative of the Kansas Legislative Research Department to ask if there's a statute. There's not one specifically in ours that holds us to that ratio, but I was curious about that in terms of figuring out if one was going to be added, we had to add two. They are still working on that. Most of their time has been on the legislative session, but that is still on their radar. I reached out to them earlier this week and they still have it on one of the things to check for us, but they have not got back to me on that yet. So I think this item is just something that will have to remain as an item for the board to consider while we continue to look and collect additional information on it. So just wanted to provide a little update to you on that for the board position. In terms of the complaint review committee, that was something that was discussed at the last meeting. And there was an interest in making sure that there was a behavior analyst on that. So the thing is on the complaint review committee that is made up of 5 board members. And so if there's not a board member for the behavior analyst, there wouldn't be able to be a member of the behavior analyst on the CRC. But also as a note, the last time that document that specifies the CRC composition was updated was 2009, and that was before addiction counselors were licensed by the board as well. So addiction counselors, that board member also cannot sit on the CRC currently. So membership on the CRC is probably something that will be discussed by the board when they go through that CRC investigation policy in May. So that'll be a topic of conversation. So I'll go ahead and reference again your recommendation to consider having a behavior analyst on there when they talk about the other rules and the structure of that investigative policy for the board. So just want to provide a couple updates on both of those items.
And being a member of CRC, we receive complaints or questions about all the professions represented by BSRB. I kind of know psychology stuff because that's where I live. But you know, it's a lot of stuff, and a lot of the unprofessional conduct statutes or regulations are similar, but there's some differences, and we certainly don't want to get someone caught between, you know, similar regulations and what we thought we were talking about. What anyway, I'm all for having a behavior analyst on the CRC. I think that'd be a great idea.
Thank you. This is Linda again, and you know, I hate to be a squeaky wheel, but I think it's really important, right? Where we are relatively new in terms of licensed professions, and even now I talk to people and people don't know what a behavior analyst does, right? So if we're governed and we're subject to licensing laws, I think we need to be represented on the board and on the ethics or the complaint review committee. So like I said, I hate to be a broken wheel and keep saying this. And so that you said, David, that meeting is in May. Is there anything that we could do as a committee to prepare a statement for you to present on our behalf? Like what's the process? I'm not that familiar. I'm somewhat familiar with
I guess one of the things too that's concerning is that hasn't been open since 2009, and there's a lot that's happened since 2009 in the state of Kansas. And you already said that like the addictions and health counseling aren't represented there either. And I feel like if we're going to have licensure for all of them, they all need to be represented because there's nuances of each of those therapy styles. So
yeah, so
I'm gonna back Linda up on that. Sorry, Linda.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the tricky things is, so the complaint review committee is made up of a subset of the board, and so the investigative policy says that there is to be a licensed psychologist on that CRC, a social worker, and then 2 public members And then another member that either represents the professional counseling, marriage and family therapy, or master's level psychology profession. So at any given time, only one of those three members of the board would sit on the CRC. And so it's in an effort to have less than a majority of the board, because I think if there are certain decisions of the CRC, they could potentially go to a different grouping of the board. Often those decisions go to the Office of Administrative Hearings should they get appealed. But I think the reason why it was set up the way that it was in part was to allow for there to be another body of the board that wouldn't have already heard the items the CRC had heard. And so that's part of the reason I think why you don't have all the professions currently sitting on the CRC at the same time. Now, I think there is still an interest in making sure that there are public members on the CRC, which if you wanted to do less than the majority but still have public members, that's why you would only have a few of those professions represented by the members. But the members are still in charge of making sure that they understand the other rules of professional conduct for the professions. So they are still responsible for looking at all of those. But in terms of your recommendation to have a member of the behavior analyst, at any given time, not all the professions have a member of the board on the CRC, but currently right now, without a board member for the behavior analyst, they would not be eligible to sit on the CRC, kind of not the same situation, but similar to the addiction counselors, as they also are not eligible to sit on the CRC. So what you can do, or what we can do, is we can have the recommendation by the advisory committee passed to the board through the chair of the board, but I'd be also happy to talk about that at the next board meeting when they go through all of that investigative policy too.
And I might add, without a behavior analyst on CRC, if something would come up, we're not flying blind. We have the two investigators who investigate all the complaints and give us a lot of background information. They live in those regulations every day. I don't. I have to admit, I don't look at the regulations every day. They do, so they're a good source of information for us. So we're not flying blind. And the public members, I think, are great, Jacqueline. Sometimes professional folks, we tend to dive down rabbit holes and think that our world consists of that rabbit hole, and they serve to help bring us back up sometimes. It's very useful. So anyway, hopefully we'll get all this stuff done. Any other comments or discussion?
Just one, because I don't know if it's like how the committee works. Do we have to show that all committee members or a majority of committee members are in favor of having Bruce presented on our behalf?
Well, so the way it's set up is, if advisory committees have recommendations, those are forwarded to the board by the chair of the advisory committee or the executive director. And so that's how those recommendations get transferred back to the board.
I was just wondering because except for Allison, I'm the only one harping on this, right? So, everybody else on the call might not think it's really as important as I think it is. So
I do, Linda.
I think it's important.
All right.
But you're saying everything so eloquently. I don't need to chime in, Linda.
Okay.
Preaching to the choir over here.
So there you have it, a consensus.
And one of my major goals as being the chair is to be duly replaced as soon as possible by a behavior analyst. So hopefully this will all work out.
Just a follow-up question on that. So I remember from the prior conversation, it's the board member, like the composition and who can be on that needs to be changed legislatively. Is that correct?
So the CRC is that is basically a BSRB policy. So it's not really a statute or regulation. It's really sort of a separate document. And so that investigative policy is something that the board has chosen to adopt. I think there's some broad framework for the board being able to investigate and handle discipline of practitioners. But in terms of how that's implemented, it's really more of a sort of, if you go on that third tier or that third hierarchy of authority. So it's not a statute and it's not a regulation. It's more of a policy the board has chosen to adopt. And so it kind of falls under that in terms of the composition of the CRC and then how they would go about administering and investigating cases and things. So
is that unless it was written into the bill that was passed by law?
So if it kind of follows that if anything is in statute, that holds as long as there's not a, if it's a direct conflict. So the statute really has the highest authority for us. So if something was put into a bill, we would follow that first and foremost. And then if it's sometimes the statute provides the framework, the details are fleshed out in regulations. And if it's not handled in those two, the board is free to adopt any other policies it chooses to do so. And that's where the investigative policy would fit.
Because I believe when we were attempting to make changes to the statute, Mike, Linda, Pete, would tell me if I'm wrong. If I remember correctly, I believe we wrote that in to the modified statute, but it never went to the floor.
I think we had talked about it in terms of representation, but I would have to default to Mike to see if we have yeah,
I don't remember.
I don't either. It's been too long. Claudia.
I can comment a little bit. This is maybe outside of this topic, but I remember at the last meeting, you mentioned that the advisory committee or that, you had done some work in the past on regulation language and different things like that. And so I did do somewhat of a deep dive back into the folder, and I did find a lot of work from back in your meetings in 2015 and a lot of that came forward in 2016 and a lot of those new changes. So I did see a lot of that work. And so it looks like all of that is, at least most of that was discussed was implemented, but there were some conversations back then about should there be a board member representing behavior analysts and different things on that topic from back in those meetings. But I didn't see any kind of specific language in those write-ups that dealt with that directly. So.
And sorry, I think maybe Claudia, we talked about it, but there was, because it was so new at the time, the conversation surrounding it was that it would have to be opened up in order to be able to insert that in there, and that could cause a whole thing.
I have another follow-up question just so that I'm clear on this whole thing. So it sounds like having a member of behavior analyst on the CRC is contingent on whether we can have a member of behavior analyst on the board. And then so sounds like the board needs, either that has to be changed in terms of that contingency, or we need to have someone on the board first. So is having someone on the board something that needs to be what is the next step or action items in terms of that?
So the board has had some preliminary discussions on if there should be movement forward on statutory language to add a member for behavior analyst. I think the board had some conversation and some concerns about the size of the number of licensees for the behavior analyst profession compared to some of the others. But there was also sort of the question of if you did move forward and add a member to the board, would you also need to add a public member, because most recent members we've added to the board have been professional members, and that's a ratio that I'm not sure if we need to hold to. And so adding 2 members to the board would be a bit different than adding 1. And so that's why I mentioned earlier that we had reached out to legislative research to see if they could check on that for us, and that's still pending with them. So I think the next step, at least as far as that goes, would be that we want to know what we're required to do first before the board can make a decision on whether it should be something that should move forward or not.
Thank you.
And then in the meantime, we can all submit our CVs to become a public member of the board. That's okay. I'm somewhat kidding.
We do have two board members who are reaching, well, actually three, that are reaching the end of a term this time coming up at the end of June. Carolyn Zafran has been one of our board members representing social work, and she's coming off the board. And Leslie C. Wester is currently the chair of the board, and she's one of our public members. And then Bruce is representing licensed psychology, and he is coming up on the end of his first term as well. So right now we're waiting on reappointments for Leslie and Bruce, and then waiting to see the governor's office in terms of appointing a new member for social work. So that'll might be something I'll be able to update you maybe at the August advisory committee meeting, because generally I think those are done real close to the July meetings. The terms would start July 1st if they're appointed before then, but those will probably be announced at the July board meeting, I'm guessing.
So just to summarize, the deterrents to approving a behavior analyst on the board are that the number of licensees is not in ratio with the other groups, and the potential of having to add not one but two additional members.
I think it's mostly the summary of the conversation on the board so far. So they've started that conversation, but I don't know that they've reached a definitive position until we have more information on those topics. So
I think that further supports, though, the need to have one of us on the board, if there really should be two of us on the board comparatively to the other professions. So there's my 2 cents on that.
I just feel like, to determine the number, like the number of certificates or licensee in to being a primary factor, that's whether we have a representation or voice on the board seems to be a little bit hard to understand. But yeah, we can work on that.
Yeah, I think part of it is because there's a fiscal side expense related to the addition of board members, because they're paid, they're compensated for their spot on the board. So I think there's probably 2 factors, and we need to advocate around those 2 factors. One is the fiscal note that would be attached to the addition, and the other one would be the size of the board.
Yeah.
Because how many are currently on the board, David?
There are 12 board members currently. And so if we did need to add a public member, if we had another professional member, it could make the board grow as much as 14 members. And so there does at some point become sort of a logistical issue of how large would you like the board to be. And so that is one of the factors too.
And I might point out, being a board member, I get paid $32.24 per meeting.
So it's not a huge fiscal note.
No, it doesn't break the bank. And that payment, I might add, is for mileage driving from Wichita only.
Okay, Bruce, I think we can go ahead and, if you're ready, we can move to the next item for old business.
Okay, the next one is continued discussion of the qualifications for license.
David, did you see my email about commenting?
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself as someone on the conference call line?
Yes, it's Michael Mose.
Okay. Well, at this meeting, there was some time provided for Holly Benenkoza, but that was the only individual who had been approved to provide public comment at this meeting.
Okay. I had sent you an email right after the last meeting requesting, I'm not going to have heard from anyone. And just to be honest, I have something directly related to what you're about to talk about. So, I mean, if it's not allowed, then I won't comment, but what y'all are about to talk about directly relates to my comment.
Okay. Well, how about if I follow up with you after the meeting? Right now, we're just kind of going with the items on the agenda, and then if there's individuals that have been approved for public comment, then they can provide information at the meetings, but otherwise it's kind of the process that we generally follow at the meetings.
Okay.
Right. Thank you. On that item, the continued discussion of the qualifications for a license. For that statute, so you received some information today from Holly Benencoza concerning the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board. I know there was a lot of material that was forwarded to you over email, and then we also provided some information to you concerning the Behavior Analysis Certification Board, the BACB. So I think instead of maybe having further conversation on the topic today, maybe it'd be helpful if you went ahead and reviewed that information and thought about some of the information that was provided by Holly today. And then maybe at the next advisory committee meeting, we could come back and then individuals could kind of discuss your thoughts on the information you had, or maybe some of your further research into information on the website or those materials. If you did have additional questions for Holly, as we mentioned during that presentation, you feel free to reach out to me and I can go ahead and coordinate getting that information back from her. And then maybe we can have a further discussion on this topic at the next advisory committee meeting. How does that sound to the members of the committee?
Sorry, this is Linda again. If I've been in conversation with some of the committee members previous to today's call about the how those two credentials either map onto each other or don't, or because it's now been presented to the board, does that preclude me from continuing those discussions?
I mean, I think you want to avoid having conversations with, a majority of the members of the committee outside of the committee. But as long as you are talking with less than a majority outside of the committee, that's fine. Just make sure your conversations are, limited, so you don't get into the realm where it would need to be something at an open meeting. But if you wanted to follow up with a member of the committee after the meeting to have further discussion on what you heard today or what you were looking for, you can continue to talk about some of those things.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I believe at the last meeting, Mike had mentioned that CASP had done an analysis of these credentialing bodies. Is that something that could be shared with us, or that additional perspective from a outside agency?
Yeah, I will probably need to get our lawyers to take a peek at it first. But yes, I do think we can get that to you in short order before the next meeting.
Thank you.
And go ahead, and if you do have access to that, go ahead and forward it to me. And if it's something that would be provided to the members of the committee, that could be something that could be requested by members of the public too. So just something to keep in mind. But if you do have materials like that you'd like me to forward to the members of the committee, just go ahead and send it to me in an email, and then I'll go ahead and provide it to the members of the committee, and then it'll be available to anyone who would request it after that point. So.
Or Mike, maybe you'll just bring that into the discussion at the next meeting, or not, your perspective informed by that. So that could also work as well.
Any other comments? Okay. We'll move on to new business. The first item there is unprofessional conduct regulations discussion. I might add, I was in the psychologist advisory committee meeting last night. We talked about some of this stuff, and everyone thought, well, this is going to be easy. And we went down a couple rabbit holes, and I'm not sure we dug ourselves all the way out. Of course, we really got hung up on, as a psychologist, who can you have sex with and when? And it turns out the unprofessional conduct was didn't give us any clear guidance on that. So we identified that. Didn't do anything about it, but it's still there. So does anyone have any general comments about this? I know last night we were talking about, should we just talk in general about the unprofessional conduct regulations, or shall we go through it kind of paragraph by paragraph and pick it apart? What's your preference?
And Bruce, before we dive too deep into this, let me just frame this conversation a little bit. For the other advisory committees, I mentioned last meeting that I'm asking each of the advisory committees to go through the unprofessional conduct regulations for their profession. And my goal is for the different advisory committees to have a thorough conversation on this topic this year. So we don't necessarily need to reach recommendations today on changes. But my hope is that we can go ahead and start the conversation today. We mentioned at the last meeting to go ahead and have you review those regulations and the language and to come back ready to discuss possible changes. Last time I had provided you with a copy of the general unprofessional conduct regulations, which is KAR 102-8-11. As well, this meeting, I went ahead and provided you a second regulation that addresses unprofessional conduct with record keeping, and that's 102-8-12. Most of the professions do have these as two separate regulations, but I want to make sure you have them both. And then just for some additional material to weigh as you think is relevant, I did go ahead and I went to the BACB website and I saw that they had a document ethics code for behavior analyst. So I went ahead and provided that to you in your materials as well. Not to say that anything in that document would need to be adopted by the Kansas board, but I thought it could be helpful. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this language. As Bruce mentioned, we could go item by item, or we could look to see if individuals have comments. Another thing we could do later on this year is that if you would like me to look for maybe some of the unprofessional conduct language from other states, I could try to grab some of that for comparison. But I do think one of the main reasons I wanted to have all the advisory committees review these regulations, I know the behavior analyst profession is the most recent to join the board. So these were last modified back in 2016. But for some of the other professions, they were last modified back in around 2004. So it had been some time since they were revised, and some of the language, should be reviewed from time to time. So just wanted to highlight what you received and some of the direction. And just to let you know too, I appreciate the conversation on this topic. I think as a public protection agency, it's very important that we look into the rules of unprofessional conduct to make sure that we're doing our due diligence, and that I can tell the legislature that we are being responsible about reviewing our statutes and regulations and making sure they're updated. But yeah, I appreciate your conversation on this. Just know that we don't necessarily need to reach a recommendation on everything today, but that this is part of a larger conversation to take place this year. So.
I can just give some, I don't know if we're going to have time to go through everything like line by line or detail, but I just in revisiting our documents from 2016 and the new ethics code, I think in general, what we have from the 2016 requirements, I think it covers in general almost every aspect. I do think a couple of things sort of stand out that we might want to add some information in about. So one, with respect to confidentiality, is social media, because that's not really touched on much in the confidentiality section. And I think there's some providing a little bit more specific with respect to use of social media with respect to confidentiality, I think would be important. I think there are a couple of things that we can add under supervision, because there have been quite a bit of changes in our field with respect to the requirements and best practices for supervision of others, because there's not a ton of that in the KAR. Let's see. There's one more major thing. I think those were the two major things that stood out to me.
I'd like to request that we update, let me find that. I think it's section J on discrimination against protected groups to reflect gender expression and identity, immigration status, and marital relationship status, which is currently reflected in the BACB's ethics guidelines.
That's a good point, Christy.
I have a question about, I think it's the O, failing to inform each client that the client can receive services from a public agency if one is employed by that public agency and also offers services privately. I guess I'm a little bit confused what that exactly was about.
Thanks, Alice. That's the one I was going to bring up. I was like, what does that even mean?
I think if you have a consulting gig on the side and you work for a public agency like a school or something like that, and they can get those services for free or way less money, they should be aware that you have affiliations with something that is a private thing on the side that might be cost more or be different, but you also provide that or similar services in a public forum as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. But I feel like maybe there's some way to make it a little bit clear in terms of the language that you just said, Claudia.
Yeah.
A little bit of wordsmithing is allowed on this.
Are we discussing the record keeping aspect as well?
Sure.
Okay. When I read through it, the requirement that records are kept for a minor 2 years past the date on which the client reaches the age of 18. If we're working with a 2-year-old, that could mean 20 years of records kept, which doesn't seem reasonable. So I'd ask for reconsideration in that aspect.
This is Linda. And it probably would fall under like consent in the protection of records or, but with the advent of telehealth, I don't know if we want to just make sure that that provision is covered and that we address the security of the connection when using an open source platform like Zoom to hold sessions. And Christy, which one is that with the record keeping? That's like 20 years is like an incredibly long time to keep a record.
It's on the bottom, Linda. It's part of 2A on that record keeping. 2 years past the date on which the client reaches the age of 18 or 6 years after the date of termination of the contact with the minor.
So would it mean that if we serve a 2-year-old, we can also not keep the record like at the age of 8? Is that
correct? It says the later of the 2 following dates.
Oh, okay.
I know for my HIPAA compliance person, she keeps records for like 7 years past their 18th birthday already. So that one didn't stand out to me as crazy, but I guess I have a person that does that as well though. So
I think that's pretty typical.
Yeah.
I always just had the 7 years in mind. Although I'm a record hoarder, right? And a document hoarder. So now I have validation for my hoarding behavior.
I remember the Tonganoxie office, Linda, so.
I have another question about the item D, about having been convicted of a crime resulting or related to one's professional practice of applied behavior analysis. So this is good information for myself. What if someone committed a different crime, like being a sex offender or something else? Is that, like, does it have to be like related to ABA, practice of ABA?
I'm pretty sure with respect to the practice of ABA, if it's any type of violent crime against another human being, it falls under that. It doesn't have to be against the child that you're working with or the person you're working with if it's a violent crime towards another human.
Okay.
So assault, things like that.
Some boards would say if you have a felony for bank robbery, that doesn't apply.
Correct.
To go back to the record keeping, for BCBAs that would work in schools, IDEA and then also KSDE requires that those records are kept for 5 years after the student either leaves the school district or graduates at 18 when they graduate from high school, or through their services that would end at age 21. So any school BCBA, that would be what they're kind of trained to do, is about 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's why it was written the way it is it took the most conservative one, and that was the rule, because there's so many different laws across, like the university has one contingency, the state of Kansas has another contingency, the BACB has another contingency, school districts have another contingency. So I think maybe it was written as the most conservative one because we weren't allowed to use more vague language, like as follows.
My fear is that so many of those, like for a school, because that's kind of my background, for a school, most of those records are kept on the school platform. And so the school is going to wipe those records. And for many of us that work in schools, yes, we can have our own private files, but a lot of times those records are out of our hands for so many of them.
And you all just identified one of the major rabbit holes that you can fall in when you start looking at records.
I will be quiet from now on that particular piece. I just wanted to say that.
No, that's a good point.
Right. So I'm going to just throw myself out here. Like, what's the utility of keeping records for 20 years?
In case the child wants them once they turn to be an adult.
Really?
Sorry.
No, it was a legitimate question, and that's a legitimate answer, right? So,
I will tell you, Linda, for us at Heart Springs, since we've been around for a very long time, we do get adults every, probably once or twice a year that either receive services at the Institute of Logopedics or even through our outpatient services, and they request their records.
Okay.
Because they're now adults and they'd like to have their own copies of their medical records.
Because I guess this may get into the details. Like if we have records of patients, like for example, at QMAD, we use the electronic system to document sessions and information. Right. So we don't necessarily have to keep handwritten all the information.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, like the data, all the data sheets, the daily data sheets and the graphs and like that.
No, it says above what it's talking about. It's like the date of where services started and stopped, progress reports. It's not the daily data sheets.
Yeah, the treatment plan. Well, it says clinical progress notes from each session. I mean.
So this was probably language taken from another area where
Yeah.
a session is once a month
Right.
and not every day.
I think the point is, especially for those of us that bill insurance, it is a part of the medical record.
Mm-hmm.
Kim, I think we still have access to the system that was at Heart Spring before I was here. So because we're still on that
Yep.
timeline, they're like
Yeah,
paying
'cause you
monthly maintenance
yep.
fee. Yeah. We don't have the physical copies, but I mean, we have the old access to the old systems where we can go into those archives and get those documentation if we need it.
Yeah.
I have another question about the billing part, about not able to provide each client with a description of the fees and the payment. So I was just thinking about each agency is going to be very different. Like for Q Medical Center, it's like, you know, it could be potentially that people who are understanding or knowing the financial information are not really the provider themselves. There are other departments. So if there's like, you know, some kind of failure on the on other departments, would that reflect really badly on the provider?
I think so in our like consent to treatment and our service agreement with families, it just says that our outpatient support services will review your fees and waivers, and here's the contact information. So we're giving them the information to get the information, but my staff especially don't have access to that.
So you basically provide the information
That it's
like,
available. Yeah.
that's available, and then the patients can choose whether they want, or clients choose whether they want to pursue more detailed information. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, our team will reach out to them as well and provide that information, but that way in our service agreement, we've at least checked the box that says that we've reviewed that. But it's not them that has to go over the like specific dollar amount.
Any other comments or discussion?
Well, a question. So like, as we're going over these, would then next time we come back with recommendations for like section J, adding the gender language in there, or marital relations from or social media or supervision line? So is that what we do now? Is like people are making recommendations and then we come back with a recommendation for wordsmithing, adding telehealth?
Yeah, I think what would be best is to go ahead and take the time as we go through meetings this year to make a list of possible changes. And then at the end of the year, maybe have a list submitted with all the changes. And so I'm kind of keeping notes as the discussion is taking place. And then maybe we can just keep adding items to the list and then review all of those at the later meetings of the year. And then kind of submit those when we get close to the end of the year, if that works for all of you guys.
Mm-hmm.
I also have another question. So I was wondering, so some of the questions, apparently Claudia was heavily involved in creating or writing this. So she has a lot of the answers, but I was just wondering whether it's possible to even create like a interpretation of, like, I understand we cannot like provide a lot of detailed information for the regulations, but let's just say like, what if we keep rotating off the board and then we don't really remember what it was about. So is that something that could be possible?
So it's interesting you bring that up. At the advisory committee meeting last night, there was discussion about this language is in a certain style, and even the formatting is a little tricky to follow because it's in a legislative style that we're bound to because they have used this style and they hold everything to this. And so it is kind of tricky to read through this. And for members of the public, the question was raised last night, would individuals from the public be able to read this and really understand, what would be a violation and what would be a reason that they might submit a complaint for a practitioner? And so there was a request by some of those individuals that could we look at presenting this information in a more friendly manner for the public to be able to understand what's all in here. And so, and Bruce, did you said you wanted to comment on that, or?
I'm just saying that was my recommendation, so I think it's very wise.
Yeah, I'm not sure the best format or the best way for us to tackle that, but you're definitely not alone in thinking that. And I think that there is an interest in that. I think that's something we'll have to think about this year, and then maybe we can try to come from an approach to do that, because I do think, a lot of the work that we do from a public protection standpoint can be reactionary. Someone violates a statute or regulation and then there's punishment. But, Leslie Allen and I, we go and we speak to groups of students and try to help them out on the front end to make sure that they're aware of some of the things that are a violation. Because in a perfect scenario, we would be able to help educate people better so that they would be more aware of what is a violation and be able to avoid those things by not committing acts that would be a violation of the standards. So that's a good point. And I think it's probably something we should look at and be thinking about how we can maybe put out a version for the public that explains some of these in a more user-friendly way.
Any other discussion? I'm looking at my clock. We only have a few moments left. Assuming we're going to end at 12. Other people may have made lunch or other schedules. Go ahead.
And that last item, I think we could talk about just briefly. That new item we added to the agenda today. And so, do you want me to talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, we just have a few moments. Go ahead.
Okay. So the board at the last board meeting, for the social work profession, we have a way that we can have pre-approved providers for social work continuing education courses. It is something that the social work profession had requested in the past. So we do have statutes and regulations outlining a process for us to follow for that. At the last board meeting, there was a question about would other professions like to have that for their professions as well. It's not a requirement to have pre-approved providers of continuing education. Some of the benefits are that individuals can submit materials, meet certain standards, and then be able to hold themselves out as a pre-approved provider, which can provide some assurance to individuals when they're taking those courses. For us, it's more work up front, but when we do auditing, it can expedite that process. Some of the topic that was discussed last night at the advisory committee is, would it give the impression that you have to be a pre-approved provider, or if you're not a pre-approved provider, would your continuing education courses still count the same? And so there are pros and cons of it, but it was asked for all the advisory committees to have a discussion on it and weigh in on it and to see, would you like that to be something that we would provide for your profession as well? There is a cost if individuals do want to submit for that, and they can do it for social work either as a pre-approved provider, or they can submit for a single course and have it be a pre-approved course, but it's all just for social work right now. So,
and the BACB already has what's called an ACE program, an approved continuing education provider designation that has to be held in order to issue CEU. So I think we're probably not necessary.
I agreed, Mike. I was going to say the same thing.
So perhaps something like that could just be imported into our rules and regs here, if we wanted to do that.
So if there was support, if there was a recommendation by the advisory committee to do that, it would be a separate write-up of regulations. But it just kind of depends. It's not something that all the advisory committees have to support, but we wanted to bring it up for your discussion to see if that's something you wanted us to work on, or if it's not something you're interested in for the profession. So.
So how does the BSRB currently determine whether something counts as a CE if the BACB's approved it?
So there's, yeah, and Leslie Allen is Assistant Director. I can go ahead and defer to her on that question.
No, we don't. We can't require that it be through BCBA because we don't have authority for that. But if it's, related to, usually by the title and the certificate is what we go by, unless we have questions. And then we would contact someone, probably Bruce or one of the committee members if we needed help with something.
Given the QABA discussion, I just quickly looked on the BACB website, and to be an ACE provider, you have to hold an active BCBA certification from what I could tell. So that could potentially influence if we have other certifications approved.
So part of the ACE one is that they are like the responsible certificant, right? And then they can have others that maybe don't, but they still have to have behavior analytic content within there. There's like a responsible person, and then others can provide.
And it all depends on if you're like the organizational, like that's how you can go to conferences and, or, be the ACE.
You can either be an ACE individual provider or you can be an ACE organization provider. So I'm the ACE liaison for my department, and we're an organizational ACE provider. So like Allison was saying, I have to determine anybody who's presenting for CEs, I have to determine if they meet credentials to be an instructor. So you have to have certain credentials to even be an instructor. To be able to give CEs, it has to have X, Y, and Z relevant behavior analytic content. It has to be for X amount of time to meet different numbers of CEs. So I don't know, like I sort of feel like there needs to be some more stringent than like the title seemed good or whatever for CEs. And we already have an entity that evaluates that and people who are credentialed that evaluate that. So I think what gets a little frustrating for us, and I understand it's Kansas law, is that we already have entities that do this. And honestly, like for my recertification as a licensed behavior analyst here in Kansas, I've never had to submit any of my CEs. I just submit my BACB recertification form. So that's why I was asking, does there even need to be somebody at the BSRB who determines whether CEs count? Because I've never had to prove my CEs.
Yeah, there's a certain number that are of individuals that are audited when those come through, and so they examine those ones that are being audited. And for the social work, that's one that they had specifically requested for us to set up something like this for their profession, but it's certainly not required, and lots of providers are not pre-approved providers. So it sounds like basically based on the conversation today that there's not a lot of support for this for the behavior analyst profession. But it's definitely something that you can think about a little bit more after this meeting. And if you have different thoughts on it, we can definitely have more conversation at the next advisory committee meeting if that would be something you guys would like. So.
Very good. Any other issues or questions, comments? The latest weather report is it quit snowing and the sun's shining in Wichita, so we're good to go.
Great. Well, Bruce, I think if we all we have left is just verifying the date of the next meeting and then the motion to adjourn.
That's right. I have that the next meeting should be, if we follow our schedule, should be Wednesday, June 8th at 10 a.m. Are there any overriding concerns or conflicts with that day and time? If not, we'll all agree to meet Wednesday, June 8th at 10 a.m. I don't believe we can take any side bets on the forecast for snow on June 8th, but I don't know, it's Kansas. So we'll see you then. Do I have a motion for adjournment?
I'll motion to adjourn.
Emily will second that.
Anyone opposed to that? We'll see you in a couple months. Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for your hard work, everybody.
Thank you.